Spider-Man 3 is a game that I grew up playing and that I loved to death. In fact, it was my very first game ever on the Xbox 360. However, Spider-Man 3 is not held in very high esteem for most people. In fact, it competes for the title of worst Spider-Man game, along with another infamous contender. Growing up, I didn't see the game's issues, being a kid and all, but now I do. Spider-Man 3 has a horrendous camera that can be so disruptive to the experience that it probably knocks the game down 2 or 3 points on a 10-point scale at least. The game is riddled with QuickTime events, remnants of a bygone era, and the faces make the Uncanny Valley effect look like the Uncanny Abyss. And overall, the game just has an unfinished feeling. The lighting in the city looks bizarre at times, and there are bugs. This game came from a movie tie-in era where franchise games had to release on the date of the movie. It feels like this game could have used another 6 months in the oven at least. Still, it's a game I have a lot of love for. While waiting for Marvel's Spider-Man 2 to come out, I decided to return to this game and give it another playthrough. And I'm gonna be honest, I had an absolute blast. Was a large part of that nostalgia? Well, yeah, absolutely. However, I don't think nostalgia explains it all. Although Spider-Man 3 is flawed, I also think it's underappreciated. It's a game with incredible ambition, and even though it clearly failed to meet its aspirations in many ways, I respect that ambition. I think there are certain things that this game does well, and I just wanted to point them out. So here are 3 reasons why I think Spider-Man 3 is underrated. At first glance, Spider-Man 3 has a fairly standard action combat system. For offense, you have light attacks, heavy attacks, and grapples. For defense, you have an auto dodge system which uses up a reflex meter when active. So, combat consists of whacking on your enemies and dodging when indicators pop up on the screen. And while this combat system is another aspect of the game that faces criticism, I'll concede that the combat system is clunky. The auto dodge doesn't always seem to work. I'll swear that I'll be holding the button yet I'll still take damage. I remember that being a thing as a kid and I experienced it this playthrough too. It could just be that the UI indication of the auto reflex being on ripples at the corners of the screen. It can be easy not to notice when it runs out. In either case, it lends to the dodge feeling a bit slipshod and unreliable. Enemies too can be irritating at times. They block your attacks and dodge a little too much, leading you to feeling like Spider-Man can't hit anything. Worst of all is the camera, as always. The camera really is this game's kryptonite. When it's swinging back and forth, and you lose your bearings while enemies are wailing on you, let me tell you it's not the best feeling. And yet, despite all of these issues, I really enjoy this game's combat system. There's just so much to the combat. Spider-Man has so many attacks at his disposal. There are a litany of combos you can use. You unlock a new one pretty much every time you beat one of the game's missions. On top of that though, I would wager that there are even more combat moves that the game doesn't even tell you about. You have to discover them by playing. I'll give a few examples. The first is the multi-launcher. After finishing the light attack combo, if you hit the heavy attack, Spider-Man will web all the enemies and launch them into the air. Another example is pinball. After finishing the heavy attack combo, if you hit the light attack repeatedly, Spider-Man will pogo between his enemies. Both attacks are listed in the combat menu as special attacks. Spider-Man has a special meter which accumulates by hitting enemies and getting hit himself. When the meter is full, Spider-Man can use a special attack with R1. However, both of the aforementioned moves can also be executed by the normal attack chains I gave, saving you from having to use a special attack charge to execute them. These aren't disclosed anywhere in the game. You discover them by experimenting with the combo system. Another example of a non-super move is the sling kick, which you can execute by ending the cannonball combo with a heavy attack. I could go on and on. Additionally, you can end any combo preemptively by charging an attack, which unleashes a more powerful charged move. Spider-Man will reel back the attack in a very satisfying slow-motion maneuver, followed by the devastating attack. So when you combine the game's litany of explicit combos, plus the discoverable combos, and the charge attacks, you end up with a combat system with a nearly endless variety of moves to play around with. What undercuts this system is balance. There are a small handful of these moves that are optimal, and the enemies don't present enough of a challenge to prevent you from spamming them. You can get through the game with 2 or 3 combos that you repeat endlessly. And if you do that, then well yeah, the combat system is boring. It gives you little incentive not to play in a boring way. That plus the mentioned clunkiness is what leads the combat system to having a bad rap. However, you get out of the combat system what you put in. If you play with the goal of experimentation and fun in mind, rather than optimal play, then there is an absolute world of opportunities to get immersed in. While playing, I approach each encounter with the goal of making Spidey look as cool as possible. By playing around with the combat system and using as many combos as I could, and seeing how I could chain different sequences together. When playing this way, I can tell you this combat is an absolute blast. I think too, it offers a depth past most of the other Spider-Man games. In fact, I think it's a depth past a lot of other combat games I've played. I haven't even touched on the black suit. Midway through the game, you unlock the black symbiote suit, and I think its integration is great. The black and red suits share many of the same combat moves, which allows you to carry forward the combos you learned while playing as the traditional Spider-Man. Generally, these are the combos listed in the combos menu. However, many of the implicit or hidden combos I mentioned earlier are different. So at first glance, the suits play very similarly, but the more you experiment, the more you discover and appreciate the nuances between them. The black suit version also replaces the special attack meter with a rage mode. While in rage, the black suit gets superpowered attacks, which get past most enemies' blocks. With how much enemies block in this game, it's a liberating feeling. Enemies absolutely ragdoll across the environment too, adding to the feeling of power. There's a risk and reward with the rage mode, because in rage mode you can choose to end it early by unleashing an even more powerful special attack. However, rage mode ends fairly suddenly and quickly, so if you wait too long, you may miss out on using a special attack. It's a balance of timing. But the key, as I said, is that this depth is intrinsic. You have to be willing to put on your hard hat and mind for it. You can ignore all this depth if you want to, and mash the square and triangle buttons until you see the credits roll. But the more you experiment for the sake of fun and pushing your own skills, the more you'll be rewarded. And for that level of intrinsic depth, the combat of Spider-Man 3 really appeals to me. Spider-Man 3's New York City feels giant. This game, more than most Spider-Man games, captures the feeling of New York being a giant metropolis, rather than just a playground you inhabit. I think this is regardless of map size. I haven't done a comparison of how big Spider-Man's map is versus the others, but I don't suspect that it's really bigger. I think this sense of scale can be attributed to a couple of things. First of all, the buildings are giant. Nearly every building in this version of New York City is a soaring skyscraper. You might be rolling your eyes. Yes, I know New York City does have a lot of skyscrapers. However, when you look at the other Spider-Man games, many of them render New York in a more realistic way, where most of the buildings aren't exactly the Chrysler Building. I think Spider-Man 3 bends the fantasy of soaring skyscrapers a bit more than the other games, lending to this big feeling. Another attributing factor is the camera angle. As much as I dog on the camera in this game, and deservedly so, one thing I give it credit for is the perspective while web swinging. There's a big distance between the camera and Spider-Man, which makes him look smaller and by contrast everything else bigger. So these add to the feeling of bigness. There are other touches though which make this New York feel grand. Spider-Man 3 doesn't limit you to the skyscrapers. You also have full access to the city's subway system and you can explore it at any time you want. One great point of entry is the Grand Central Station. That leads to another point. Spider-Man 3 allows you to explore a surprising amount of buildings in this game. There's the aforementioned Grand Central Station as well as a natural history museum, which you can just walk into whenever you want. In some city crimes even, you often enter bank vaults. During this playthrough, there was even a city event where I observed criminals breaking into a high-rise. You actually then entered the high-rise through the broken window and fought the criminals indoors. This wasn't a story mission, it was just a random event in the city. Unfortunately, it of course happened while I wasn't recording, so I don't have footage of it. The subway system and the skyways aren't all. There's also the sewer system which you can play around in. All of this contributes to a New York City that feels truly big. This is another area of the game I feel like is truly underappreciated. Spider-Man 3 has a lot of story missions, 42 to be exact. It's a pretty respectable number in my opinion. However, what I really find impressive is the surprising variety to these missions. They aren't just copy-paste, go here and punch these bad guys. Don't get me wrong, you'll be doing a lot of punching bad guys throughout the game. However, the surrounding context and goals differ a ton. The missions are divided into distinct storylines. There's a storyline that follows the main plot of the movie. There are storylines that are tied to Spider-Man villains like the Scorpion and Lizard. Then there are storylines tied to the gangs plaguing New York, like the Apocalypse Gang, the Arsenic Candy Girls, yeah, I'm serious, and the Dragon Tail. The mission order is fairly non-linear. There's a lot of freedom in which order you tackle the missions. The movie plot missions are generally unlocked after a certain progress is made on the other quest lines, and further plot lines unlock along the way. The Kingpin of Crime missions serve as a nice conclusion to the gang quests, and see you fighting the Kingpin as well as all 3 gang leaders. So just from this description, you can see that there's a lot to bite on here. A ton of supervillains are in the game, and as always, it's fun to take on Spidey's rogues gallery. But the mission structure varies greatly too. For instance, in one Dragon Tail mission, you have to track down a hideout by following statues strewn out on the road, which are falling out of a van. For missions where you work with a cop, Jean DeWolf, you have to stealthily take pictures of undercover cops and catch them in the act as they make corrupt deals. During some Scorpion missions, you're infiltrating high-tech facilities where you have to crawl around security lasers. During the Mad Bomber missions, well, you're defusing a lot of bombs, maybe a few too many bombs. In the first Lizard mission, you have to take pictures of lizards that have been appearing in the city. The scale is also talking about adds to this variety. In some of the Mad Bomber missions, you travel through the subway systems, and in many of the Lizard missions, you're using the underground subway. There's a great visual variety between levels. There are just so many unique animations and game mechanics, which are used in only 1 or 2 missions. It's something I find truly impressive, and I don't really think any other Spider-Man game matches this sheer variety you get in Spider-Man 3. You might have noticed a trend with these 3 reasons I provided. Spider-Man 3 is a game that dreams big. Its combat system, while flawed, is absolutely flooded with combo moves, leaving you with nearly unlimited options. The city feels big, and gives you not only the above-ground city to explore, but also the sewers and subways. And the game is stuffed to the brim with missions. There are tons of villains, factions, and variety in each of them. Even though the quality varies significantly, there is definitely quantity. Bigger isn't always better, but there's still something to say about it, isn't there? Spider-Man 3 aims high, probably too high. If the scale was cut down to a more manageable size to meet the immovable movie release deadline, it's likely that we would have had a more polished, clean game. However, I have a soft spot for games that feel like they had true ambition put behind them. And for me at least, Spider-Man 3 fits that bill. I loved this game, warts and all, and I wanted to spread that appreciation a bit with this video. If you like this video, please consider giving it a like or subscribing to the channel. If you want to support me further, I'm also a science fiction writer with a series of post-apocalyptic novels. Check out the link in the description if you want to learn more. Until next time.